I remember that night like it was yesterday. I had just finished a long shift at work and decided to stop by my usual bar for a drink. It was one of those places where the lighting was dim and the music was low, perfect for unwinding. I grabbed a seat at the counter, ordered my usual, and just let the tension of the day melt away. That's when I noticed the guy sitting a few stools down. He looked about my age, maybe a little older, with a kind of laid-back vibe. We exchanged nods, and before long, we were chatting. He was easy to talk to, with a friendly smile and a calm voice. We talked about the usual stuff: sports, the weather, and how work was going. Nothing too deep, but it was nice to have someone to shoot the breeze with. As the night went on, we kept the conversation going, and I found myself thinking, this guy is actually pretty cool. He didn't overshare or ask too many questions, just enough to keep things interesting. When I finished my drink, I felt like I had made a new friend. We shook hands and went our separate ways, but I figured I'd see him around again. Sure enough, over the next few weeks, we ran into each other at the bar a few more times. It became kind of a routine. We'd chat about the latest game or some local news, maybe laugh about something stupid we saw online. It wasn't like we were best friends, but there was something comforting about seeing a familiar face at the end of a long day. I never really thought much about it, but every now and then, I'd catch myself wondering who this guy really was. He never talked much about his personal life, which wasn't weird at first, but after a few weeks, it started to stand out. But I wasn't about to pry. Everyone has their reasons for keeping things to themselves, and I respected that. Looking back, there were probably little signs that something was off, but at the time, I didn't see them. I just enjoyed having someone to chat with. Little did I know, those casual conversations were about to take on a whole new meaning. A few weeks went by, and I realized I hadn't seen him around. It wasn't like we were keeping tabs on each other, but his absence felt strange. The bar was still the same bartender, same regulars, but it was like something was missing. I figured he probably just got busy with work or found another spot to hang out. People come and go, no big deal. One night, I was sitting at the bar, nursing my drink, when I overheard a conversation between two guys a few seats over. They were talking about some big news. A serial killer had been caught. The name didn't ring any bells at first, so I didn't pay much attention. But then one of them mentioned something about the guy frequenting bars in the area. That got me curious. I leaned in a little closer, trying to catch more details without looking like I was eavesdropping. The more they talked, the more uneasy I felt. The descriptions they were throwing around, late 30s, medium build, clean-shaven, sounded way too familiar. My stomach tightened as I realized they were talking about the guy I'd been hanging out with. It couldn't be him, though. The guy I knew was chill, friendly. There was no way he could be the monster they were describing. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I started replaying our conversations in my head, searching for any signs that I might have missed. Nothing stood out, though. He had been polite, almost too normal. It was like he had gone out of his way to blend in, to not raise any red flags. That night, I went home feeling unsettled. I couldn't get the idea out of my head that I might have been drinking with a killer. I even thought about going to the police, but what would I say? Hey, I had a few beers with a guy who fits the description of a serial killer. It sounded ridiculous. Besides, I had no real evidence, just a gut feeling. I tried to forget about it, convincing myself I was being paranoid, but the thought kept gnawing at me. Every time I walked into that bar, I half expected to see him sitting there, smiling like nothing was wrong. But he never showed up again, and that only made things worse. It was like he had vanished into thin air, leaving me with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. A few months later, I got a letter in the mail summoning me for jury duty. I wasn't thrilled, but it's one of those things you can't avoid. I showed up on the day I was supposed to, expecting to sit through some boring civil case or maybe something minor like a traffic violation, the usual stuff. But when I got there, the atmosphere was tense, like everyone knew something serious was about to go down. They ushered us into the courtroom, and that's when I saw the name on the docket. Derek Todd Lee. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that name from the news, the serial killer they'd caught a while back. The one who'd been terrorizing the area for years. The one who had slipped under the radar, blending in like any regular guy. I started to feel sick, like the room was closing in on me. As they went through the jury selection process, my mind was racing. All I could think about was the guy I'd met at the bar, Derek Todd Lee. It was him, the guy I'd had drinks with, joked around with, the guy who seemed so normal. And now I was sitting here, about to be part of the jury that would decide his fate. It felt surreal, like I was in some kind of twisted nightmare. When they called my name, I barely managed to get to my feet. I could feel my hands shaking as I walked up to the bench. The judge asked me a few routine questions, but I could hardly focus. All I could see was that face, the one I thought I knew, staring back at me from the defendant's seat. It was him, no doubt about it. The same guy who had bought me a drink and talked about nothing in particular, like he didn't have a care in the world. They must have seen the look on my face, because the next thing I knew, the judge was asking if I was okay. I mumbled something about knowing the defendant, and they quickly dismissed me from the jury pool. I stumbled out of the courtroom, my mind spinning. I couldn't believe what had just happened. It was like I'd been dropped into a bad movie, one where the plot takes a sudden, dark turn. As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief mixed with horror. Relief that I didn't have to sit through the trial, didn't have to relive those moments in the bar over and over in my head, but also horror because I'd been so close to someone capable of such terrible things. I thought back to all those nights, all those conversations, and it made my skin crawl. How had I not seen it? How had I missed the signs? After leaving the courthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd dodged a bullet. But there was no getting away from the memories. They kept coming back, stronger each time. Every detail of our conversations played over in my mind, like a broken record. The way he laughed at my stupid jokes, the casual way he talked about life, it all seemed so harmless at the time. But now, knowing who he really was, it felt twisted. I started to wonder if he'd been sizing me up, playing some kind of sick game, seeing how close he could get without me knowing. For days, I couldn't focus on anything else. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see his face, that same easy smile he always wore at the bar. I kept thinking about how he must have seen me, just another guy to pass the time with, maybe even another potential victim. It made my stomach turn. I felt dirty, like I needed to wash the memory of him off me. But no matter what I did, it clung to me like a shadow. I didn't tell anyone at first. How could I? Who would believe that I'd unknowingly befriended a serial killer? It sounded insane, like something out of a crime novel. But it was real, and it had happened to me. I thought about going back to the bar, but the idea of sitting on that same stool, drinking at the same counter where I'd shared drinks with Derek, made my skin crawl. The bar wasn't a place I could ever go back to, not with the memories tainted like that. Eventually, I decided to look up more about Derek Todd Lee. I knew it would mess with my head, but I had to know. I had to understand how I'd missed it. I read every article, watched every news clip I could find. The more I learned, the sicker I felt. This man, who I'd thought of as a friend, had done things so horrific I couldn't even wrap my mind around them. The details were grisly, the stuff of nightmares. And the fact that I had been sitting across from him, clueless, made me feel like a fool. I started to distance myself from people after that. It wasn't intentional at first, but I just couldn't trust anyone. If I could be fooled so easily by someone like Derek, how could I ever trust my own judgment again? Every stranger felt like a potential threat, every friendly face a mask hiding something dark. It was exhausting, living like that, but I couldn't help it. The world had changed, and there was no going back. I thought about seeing a therapist, but the idea of talking about it out loud made me anxious. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought I was crazy, or worse, that I'd known all along? I couldn't deal with the judgment, real or imagined, so I kept it to myself. I buried it deep, but no matter how hard I tried, it kept finding its way back to the surface. I thought the weight of it would eventually fade, but it didn't. The days turned into weeks, then months, and still, Derek's shadow loomed over everything. I started noticing things I hadn't before, little moments that now seemed sinister in hindsight. Like the time he asked about my family, if I lived alone. I'd brushed it off as small talk, but now it felt like something more, like he was probing, testing the waters. Every time I walked into a room, I found myself scanning the faces, looking for signs of deception. I questioned everyone's motives, replaying conversations in my head to see if I'd missed anything, if someone else was hiding a dark secret. It was a constant, gnawing paranoia that I couldn't shake. I knew it wasn't healthy, but what was I supposed to do? Trust was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. I became obsessed with true crime stories, reading about other killers, trying to understand what drove someone to do the things Derek had done. I wanted to believe that there was some pattern, some way to identify people like him before they struck. But the more I read, the more I realized how random it all was. There were no clear signs, no easy answers, just regular people who, for reasons beyond comprehension, turned into monsters. One night, I was sitting in my living room, the TV playing some crime documentary in the background, when it hit me. I'd never really known Derek at all. The man I'd called a friend was just a mask, a role he played to fit in, to blend with the crowd. Everything I thought I knew about him was a lie, carefully constructed to keep people like me in the dark. That realization shook me to my core. How many others were out there, hiding behind friendly faces? I decided to move. The memories of that bar, that town, were too much. I needed a fresh start, somewhere I could try to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. But even after I settled in a new place, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked down the street or entered a crowded room, I felt eyes on me, like someone was waiting for me to let my guard down. In the end, I realized there was no outrunning it. What happened with Derek had changed me, and there was no going back. The world wasn't the same place it had been before, and I wasn't the same person. I had to accept that. But I also knew that I'd never let myself get that close to anyone again. Not after what I'd been through. The cost was just too high. When I first moved into the house, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. It wasn't much, just a small place in a quiet neighborhood, but it was perfect for what I needed, a space to focus on my writing. The rent was affordable, and it felt like a fresh start. The street was peaceful, with only a few cars passing by each day, and the neighbors kept to themselves. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal, but I didn't think much of it. The first few days went by smoothly. I spent most of my time setting up my workspace and trying to get into a writing routine. It was late one night, after hours of working on my manuscript, that I first heard the knocking. It was just after midnight, and the sound was soft but deliberate. I got up, thinking it might be the wind or maybe an animal, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. The street was empty, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves. I shrugged it off as a prank. Maybe some kids messing around, getting an early start on Halloween. I wasn't too concerned at first. The next night, though, the knocking came again. Same time, same soft, insistent knocks. This time I was quicker to the door, but again, no one was there. I looked around, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing unusual. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired, hearing things that weren't there. As the week went on, the knocking became a routine, always at the same time, always the same sound. It started to get under my skin. I found myself dreading the nights, knowing that at midnight the knocks would come. I even stayed up late, trying to catch whoever or whatever it was, but I never saw anything. It was like the noise was taunting me, knowing I couldn't catch it in time. One night, after the usual knocking, I decided to step outside and take a look around. The street was empty, the houses dark, and the air cold. I stood there for a while, scanning the shadows, but nothing moved. Just as I was about to go back inside, I noticed something in the distance, a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of my yard. It was hard to make out any details, but it was there, just watching. My heart pounded as I stared at it, frozen in place, until it slowly backed away into the darkness. I couldn't sleep after that. The image of that shadow, standing so still, stayed with me. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The knocks, the shadow, they were connected. I didn't know how, but I felt like I was being watched, even when I was alone in my own home. After seeing that shadow, everything changed. It wasn't just the knocks anymore. I started hearing strange noises throughout the night, creaks, whispers, and faint footsteps that seemed to come from just outside my window. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, feeling like someone was in the room with me, watching from the dark corners. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. During the day, things were normal. I'd go about my routine, writing and working on my project. But as soon as the sun set, the dread would creep back in. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that stress was playing tricks on me. But the knocks, they were real, and they kept coming, every single night, like clockwork. It was almost as if whatever was out there knew I was scared and was feeding off that fear. One evening, as I was trying to focus on my writing, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my phone for light and made my way to the circuit breaker, trying to stay calm. But as I walked through the hallway, I heard it again, the knocking. It was louder this time, more aggressive, as if whoever or whatever it was growing impatient. My hands shook as I fumbled with the flashlight app, and when I finally got it on, the beam of light landed on the front door. The knock stopped. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to gather the courage to open it. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. What if it wasn't kids playing a prank? What if it was something worse? I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached out, hand trembling, and turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the empty porch. The street was deserted, not a single soul in sight. That's when I saw it again, the shadow, now closer than before, standing at the edge of my driveway. This time, I could see it more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape was vaguely human but distorted, like it didn't quite belong. I could feel its gaze on me, though it had no eyes, no face, just a dark, looming presence that filled me with a terror I'd never known before. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, every light in the house turned on. Sleep was impossible. Every noise made me jump. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see that shadow peering in. But it never did. It stayed outside, waiting. The knocks didn't come again that night, but I knew it wasn't over. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. The next day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mind kept drifting back to the shadow and those relentless knocks. Every time I tried to write, my hands would shake, and I'd lose my train of thought. I knew I needed to do something, but I had no idea where to start. Was it just me, or was there something truly wrong with this place? I decided to do some research, hoping to find a logical explanation for what I'd been experiencing. I spent hours online, looking up anything I could find about the house, the neighborhood, and even the land it was built on. There were no reports of strange occurrences, no legends or urban myths tied to the area. Everything seemed normal, which only made me feel more isolated in my fear. I even asked a few neighbors, casually, if they'd ever experienced anything unusual. They all gave me the same answer: no. It was just me. Later that evening, as I was making dinner, I heard a thud coming from the basement. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to brush it off, thinking something must have fallen over. But the idea of going down there made my skin crawl. I hadn't spent much time in the basement since moving in. It was damp and cluttered, filled with old furniture and boxes left behind by the previous owners. The thought of venturing down those steps alone was terrifying. I grabbed a kitchen knife, more for comfort than anything, and slowly made my way to the basement door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my breath shaky. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I opened the door, and the smell of mildew hit me. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the darkness below growing thicker with each step. The basement was as I remembered, cold, damp, and filled with shadows. I shone my flashlight around, scanning the room for anything out of place. Everything seemed normal at first glance. But then, in the corner, I noticed something odd. A wooden chest, half hidden behind a stack of old newspapers. I hadn't seen it before, and curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and brushed off the dust, revealing a rusty lock. It was strange, like it didn't belong there. I hesitated before opening it. A part of me knew whatever was inside might change everything. But I couldn't walk away now, not after everything I'd been through. I forced the lock open, and the lid creaked as I lifted it. Inside, there were old photos, letters, and a few trinkets. They looked ancient, like they hadn't been touched in years. As I sifted through them, I realized these belonged to the family that lived here before me. The sight of their faces, frozen in time, sent a chill down my spine. At the very bottom of the chest, I found a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it, and as I began to read, the words on the page sent a wave of dread through me. It detailed the lives of the family, happy at first, but as I read on, the entries grew darker, filled with fear and desperation. The last few entries mentioned something about a shadow and how it wouldn't leave them alone. They tried to move away, but the shadow followed. My hands shook as I read the final entry. "We can't escape. It's always there, watching, waiting. If you find this, it's too late." I dropped the journal, my breath catching in my throat. The words blurred as my mind raced. The shadow had haunted the family before me, just as it was haunting me now. A deep sense of dread settled over me, heavier than anything I'd ever felt. I needed to get out of that basement, out of that house, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Every creak, every whisper of air felt like it was alive, closing in on me. I forced myself to move, backing away from the chest slowly, keeping my eyes on it as if it might spring to life. The journal's words echoed in my head, repeating themselves until they were the only thing I could hear. "It's too late." The warning pounded in my skull, urging me to leave, to run and never look back. But I couldn't. I was trapped by my own fear, paralyzed in that cold, dark basement. Finally, I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me as if that could keep the darkness at bay. My chest heaved, and I collapsed onto the floor, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of everything. How could a shadow, just a shadow, hold so much power? What had the family done to anger it, and why was it still here, tormenting me? The questions circled in my mind, but I knew I wouldn't find answers sitting on the floor, trembling like a child. I had to know more, had to understand what I was dealing with. The journal was a start, but it couldn't be the whole story. I needed to find out who that family was, what happened to them, and if there was any way to stop whatever this was before it consumed me too. I spent the next few days digging into every piece of information I could find. I visited the local library, combed through old records, even spoke to some older residents in the area. Their faces grew pale when I mentioned the house, their eyes darting away as if they didn't want to remember. One woman, her voice barely a whisper, told me the family had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. Some said they moved, others believed they'd met a darker fate, but no one really knew. As the pieces fell into place, I realized the shadow wasn't just some ghostly presence. It was something much worse, something that fed on fear, on despair. It had driven that family to madness, and now it was trying to do the same to me. I had to act fast, or I'd be next. The only question was, how do you fight something you can't even see, something that had already claimed so many lives? I couldn't stay in that house anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with something I couldn't explain, but could definitely feel. I packed my things as quickly as I could, throwing clothes into bags without care. My hands shook, and I fumbled with the zippers, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if I didn't leave fast enough. I had to get out before it was too late. As I loaded the last bag into my car, I felt it, an icy chill creeping up my spine. I didn't want to turn around, but some force compelled me to. There, just at the edge of my yard, the shadow loomed, larger than I'd ever seen it before. It stood there, almost like it was watching me, daring me to stay. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to move or even think. It was like the shadow was sucking the life out of me, feeding on my fear. I snapped out of it and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. My hands were sweating as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I didn't look back as I drove away. I couldn't. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. I just kept driving, trying to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. When I finally got to my mom's place, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The familiar surroundings, the warmth of the place, it all felt safe, or at least safer than where I'd come from. But that night, as I lay in bed, trying to convince myself that it was over, something gnawed at me. That shadow, whatever it was, didn't seem like the kind to just let go. I tried to settle into a new routine, pretending like things were normal. But every night, around the same time, I'd find myself standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. I told myself it was just a habit, that I was only checking to make sure I was really safe. But deep down, I knew better. I was looking for it, waiting for it, and every night, without fail, I'd see it. The shadow, standing just beyond the streetlight, always watching, always waiting. I don't know how long this will go on. Maybe it'll follow me forever, haunting every step I take. Or maybe one day I'll look out the window and it won't be there. But until then, all I can do is try to live my life, knowing that no matter where I go, that shadow will always be lurking, just out of sight. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and life seemed simple and safe. One of my closest friends during those days was Eric. His family was well off, and they owned a stunning beach house that stood out in its grandeur. This wasn't just any beach house. It was a sprawling, two-story home perched on a secluded stretch of coastline, surrounded by dense woods on one side and the vast ocean on the other. The house was a place of endless summer days and carefree nights. It had everything a kid could dream of: a massive pool, a game room filled with all the latest gadgets, and a view of the ocean that could take your breath away. But perhaps the most interesting part of the property was the small detached apartment near the back of the house, where Maria, their full-time maid, lived. Maria was a quiet woman, always polite and efficient in her work. She had been with Eric's family for years, almost like part of the family, but there was always a slight air of mystery around her. The beach house was our go-to destination during holidays and long weekends. Eric's parents would often invite me to join them, and I never turned down the offer. Those trips were filled with laughter, the sound of the waves crashing, and the smell of salt in the air. It was a place that represented peace and joy, at least until that weekend when everything changed. It was supposed to be another one of those perfect weekends. Eric's family had planned a getaway, and as usual, I was invited. We arrived at the house just as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden hue over the property. But as soon as we stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The first thing we noticed was the silence. The house, usually filled with the sound of the ocean breeze and the hum of appliances, was eerily quiet. As we moved further in, the full extent of the devastation became apparent. The living room, once immaculate, was in shambles. The television was gone, ripped from the wall mount. Furniture was overturned, cushions shredded, and glass from broken picture frames littered the floor. Eric's mother gasped as she entered the kitchen. Cabinets were wide open, dishes smashed on the ground, and the fridge stood empty with its door ajar. Every room we checked was the same, if not worse. The house had been thoroughly ransacked, as if someone had taken their time to destroy every piece of the home they could. A sense of dread began to creep in as we realized the extent of the damage. Then, someone mentioned Maria. We all rushed to the back of the property where her small apartment was located. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual for Maria, who was meticulous about locking up. Inside, it was as if she had never existed. Her belongings were gone, no clothes in the closet, no personal items left behind, not even a note. The small space was as empty as the main house was chaotic. When the police arrived, they did a cursory examination, clearly disinterested in the case. They barely asked any questions, simply noting the missing items and the state of the house. When it came to Maria, they shrugged it off, suggesting that she might have been involved in the break-in and then disappeared with the loot. It was an easy explanation, one that made sense on the surface, so everyone believed it. For a week, that was the story we all told ourselves. But deep down, something about it didn't feel right. There was a coldness in the air that lingered, a sense that we were missing something important, something terrifyingly close. That entire week felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the beach house, the way everything was turned upside down, how Maria's apartment was eerily empty. It gnawed at me. I could tell Eric's parents were shaken too, even though they tried to act like everything was normal. I could see it in their eyes, the way they jumped at every little sound, the way they avoided talking about it. Eric and I didn't speak about it much either. He was quiet, more withdrawn than usual, and every time I tried to bring it up, he'd change the subject. But it was always there, hanging between us like a shadow. I could feel something was off. It wasn't just the break-in, it was the way the house felt. It was like a weight pressing down on me, a sense that something terrible had happened, and we were only scratching the surface. The following weekend, Eric's dad decided to go back to the house to replace the locks. He didn't want to take any chances. I remember him telling my parents about it over the phone. "I'm not leaving that place unsecured," he said. "Not after what happened." He took the dogs with him, a couple of big, friendly mutts that usually wouldn't hurt a fly. I think he wanted the company, maybe a little extra protection. I don't know, but I remember feeling uneasy when he left. Something about the whole situation just didn't sit right with me. Later that day, my mom got a call. I was sitting in the living room trying to focus on a video game, but I could hear her talking in the kitchen. Her voice was low, tense, and I knew something was wrong. I paused the game and listened, my stomach twisting into knots. When she hung up, she came into the room, her face pale. "Eric's dad found Maria," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's dead. They found her buried in the backyard." I couldn't breathe. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Maria was dead? I couldn't wrap my head around it. How? Why? My mind raced, trying to piece it together, but nothing made sense. I remembered how the police had said she might have been involved, how we all believed it. But now, knowing she was buried there, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Eric's dad told my parents later that night that one of the dogs had started digging near the pool. He hadn't thought much of it at first, but the dog wouldn't stop. When he went to check, he saw something sticking out from under the tarp. He moved it aside, and there she was. Maria, her body twisted, her face frozen in a look of pure terror. The thought of her lying there all that time, just feet away from where we'd all been, made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the empty house, the overturned furniture. I kept thinking about how close we had been, how we'd walked right past that spot, completely unaware. The worst part was knowing that whoever had done it was still out there. Someone who had known her, maybe even someone we knew. And they were still out there, walking around, going on with their lives like nothing had happened. The thought made my blood run cold. After they found Maria, everything changed. The house, once a place of laughter and sunlight, now felt like a tomb. Eric's parents didn't say much, but I could tell they were terrified. They kept us close, wouldn't let us out of their sight, like they were afraid something might happen to us next. I couldn't blame them. I was scared too. Every time I thought about going back to that place, my chest tightened and my hands started shaking. Eric's dad wouldn't talk about what he saw, but I overheard him telling my dad that Maria's body was wrong. He didn't go into details, but the way he said it, the way his voice trembled, I knew it wasn't just the fact that she was dead. There was something else, something he couldn't bring himself to say. My imagination filled in the blanks, and each scenario was worse than the last. I couldn't shake the image of her lying there, twisted, broken, hidden under that tarp like someone's forgotten trash. The police came back after that, of course. This time, they were serious, asking questions, taking everything apart, looking for clues. They even brought in some kind of forensic team. I watched from a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. The officers didn't seem to notice us kids, but I noticed them. Their faces were grim, their movements tense, It wasn't just a routine investigation anymore. They were looking for something, or maybe someone, who had done this. Eric was quieter than usual, barely speaking a word. I tried to get him to talk, but he just stared off into space, lost in his thoughts. I could see the fear in his eyes, the confusion. He was trying to process it, just like I was. But how do you make sense of something like that? How do you come to terms with the fact that someone you trusted, someone who had been a part of your life for years, could end up buried in your own backyard? At night, the nightmares started. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, the images of Maria's face, her lifeless eyes, burned into my mind. Sometimes I'd hear noises in the dark, soft whispers, the sound of footsteps where there shouldn't be any. I'd lie there, frozen, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. I'd tell myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't help. The fear was real, suffocating, and it wouldn't let go. I didn't want to go back to the beach house, but Eric's family insisted. They needed to clean up, put things back together, try to move on. They didn't want to be alone, and I couldn't say no. So we went. The moment we stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of death, of fear. I could feel it, like a cold hand wrapping around my throat, squeezing until I could barely breathe. The house was no longer just a house. It was a graveyard, and the ghosts weren't going to let us leave. The horror of finding her body buried in that cold earth beneath the tarp shook me to my core. It wasn't just the sight of her lifeless form, but the terror etched on her face that chilled me. As I knelt beside her, disbelief and dread mingled in my mind. The questions raced. Who could do this? Why here, in this place of tranquility? The once serene surroundings now felt suffocating, each shadow a potential hiding place for a malevolent presence. I couldn't shake the image of her eyes wide open in fear, silently screaming for help that never came. The dogs, usually a source of comfort, whined uneasily beside me, as if sensing the evil that had tainted our sanctuary. My mind raced with scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. Was the killer still here, watching us from the darkness? Or had they fled, leaving behind only their cruel handiwork? The discovery shattered any illusion of safety I had held on to. This wasn't just a break-in gone wrong. It was a calculated act of brutality. The police's dismissiveness now felt like a betrayal in itself. They hadn't seen her as a victim, but as a suspect. Anger simmered beneath my fear, a primal urge to find justice for her, to uncover the truth buried alongside her in that desecrated ground. As I stumbled back towards the house, my thoughts turned to the family. How would they cope with this revelation? The once vibrant beach house now felt haunted, its walls echoing with the horror we had unearthed. And as I glanced back at the shallow grave, a sickening realization dawned on me. The killer had known her intimately. This wasn't random, it was personal. They had chosen this place, this time, for a reason known only to them, a reason that filled me with a chilling uncertainty about what other secrets this tranquil facade might hide. In the days that followed, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, felt like a prelude to another nightmare. The police investigation trudged on, but without answers. The fear gnawed deeper. The once idyllic beach house had become a prison of paranoia, where every shadow seemed to whisper a sinister truth. And as I stared out at the serene ocean beyond, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent lingered, waiting to strike again. The hospital corridors felt endless, a labyrinth of cold, sterile walls. Each step I took seemed to echo louder than the last, as if the very building was mocking me. I had been here for nearly 6 months, and the place still gave me chills. The night shifts were the worst. It wasn't just the quiet or the darkness that pressed in from every corner. It was something else, something that made my skin crawl whenever I was alone. "Room 302 needs you," a voice crackled through my earpiece. I recognized the tone. It was Susan, always calm, always professional. But tonight, even her voice seemed off, like she was trying to suppress something. I shook the thought away, forcing myself to focus. "On my way," I replied, my voice betraying nothing. As I walked, I could feel the familiar weight of the syringe in my pocket. The cold metal pressed against my leg, a constant reminder of the task at hand. I had done this dozens of times before, yet the unease never left me. Was it fear? No, not fear. It was more like anticipation, an itch that needed to be scratched, a craving that grew stronger with each passing day. When I reached room 302, I paused outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. For a moment, I considered turning back, just walking away and leaving the syringe untouched. But that thought quickly dissolved as I reminded myself of the necessity of it all. I pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit room. The patient, an elderly man with thinning white hair, lay still in his bed. His breathing was shallow, barely more than a whisper in the quiet room. I approached slowly, my footsteps silent on the tiled floor. As I reached the bedside, I saw his eyes flutter open. For a split second, they met mine, cloudy, but with a spark of recognition. "Help me," he whispered, his voice weak but desperate. My heart pounded in my chest, louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm here to help," I replied softly, pulling the syringe from my pocket. His gaze flickered to it, a flash of fear crossing his features before it vanished into resignation. He didn't resist as I leaned over, sliding the needle into the IV port with practiced ease. As the liquid entered his bloodstream, I watched him closely. His breathing slowed even more, his body relaxing into the bed as if he was simply falling asleep. I stood there, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. This is for the best, I told myself. They never suffer, never feel a thing. But deep down, beneath the rationalizations, I knew the truth. This wasn't about mercy or kindness. This was about power, my power over life and death. And it was intoxicating. As I stepped out of the room, my mind was buzzing. The silence of the corridor felt heavy, like the walls were closing in, suffocating me with the weight of what I had just done. My hand trembled slightly as I slipped the empty syringe back into my pocket. I could still feel the warmth of the patient's skin on my fingers, a ghostly reminder of his final moments. He had looked at me with such trust, such blind faith that I was there to ease his pain. And in a way, I had. But not for the reasons he thought. I headed down the hallway, each step bringing me closer to the nurse's station. Susan was there, typing something into the computer, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. She didn't look up as I approached, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching, judging. I wondered if she knew, if she had any idea of what I had just done. But then again, how could she? They all saw me as the quiet, diligent nurse who worked the graveyard shift because I cared about the patients. If only they knew the truth. "Everything okay in there?" Susan's voice broke the silence, pulling me from my thoughts. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "He's comfortable now." She nodded, her eyes lingering on me for a moment longer before turning back to the screen. I could tell she was tired, maybe even relieved that I had taken care of the old man. But there was something else, something in the way she looked at me that made my skin prickle. Was it suspicion? Or just exhaustion? I couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. As I walked away, I felt a flicker of doubt, a small voice in the back of my mind that questioned everything. Was I getting sloppy? Had I left a clue, a sign that someone might notice? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. No, I was careful. I always was. I had to be. But as I made my way down the stairs to the supply room, the doubt lingered. I had been doing this for years, moving from one hospital to the next, always careful, always precise. Yet lately something had changed. The thrill, the satisfaction I once felt was beginning to slip through my fingers, replaced by a creeping unease. It was as if the walls were closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. In the supply room, I busied myself with restocking IV bags, my hands moving automatically as my mind raced. I glanced at the rows of clear plastic bags, each one a potential instrument of death. It was so easy, so simple to alter just one. A quick injection in the right spot, and no one would ever know until it was too late. But tonight, the thought didn't bring the usual sense of satisfaction. Instead, it left me cold. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching, but the room was empty. Just me, the bags, and the syringe in my pocket. I had always thought of myself as in control, the one who decided who lived and who died. But tonight, for the first time, I felt a shadow of doubt, and that scared me more than anything else. The supply room felt like a tomb, silent and still. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow that made everything seem lifeless. As I stood there, surrounded by rows of IV bags and sterile supplies, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The syringe was still in my pocket, a cold, hard reminder of what I had done. I could feel it pressing against my leg, almost as if it was burning through the fabric of my scrubs. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the smooth plastic. A part of me wanted to throw it away, to get rid of the evidence and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But another part, the part that had driven me to this point, refused to let go. I was in too deep, and there was no turning back now. "Get it together," I whispered to myself, trying to steady my breathing. My voice echoed in the empty room, bouncing off the walls and coming back to me like a taunt. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to focus. I had done this before, countless times. I was careful, meticulous. There was no reason to doubt myself now. But the doubt was there, lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow. I could almost hear it whispering to me, telling me that I was going to get caught, that someone would figure out what I had done. It gnawed at me, eating away at my confidence, until all that was left was a hollow pit of fear. I turned to leave the supply room, but my hand froze on the doorknob. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to move, trapped by the weight of my own actions. What if someone was waiting on the other side of the door? What if they knew? I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside my head. No one knew. They couldn't. I had been too careful. I repeated the words like a mantra, trying to convince myself that they were true. Slowly, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The hallway was empty, just as I had left it. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me. I started walking, each step echoing in the silence, a reminder of the footsteps I could never erase. But with every step, the doubt grew stronger, clawing at my sanity, threatening to unravel everything I had built. And for the first time, I wondered if I was losing control. The night shift was always the hardest. The quiet hours between midnight and dawn seemed to stretch on forever, filled with a suffocating silence that made every small sound seem amplified. I wandered through the dimly lit corridors of the hospital, feeling like a ghost in a place where I no longer belonged. As I walked past the patient rooms, I caught myself glancing inside. Each room was a small, dark box where patients lay, vulnerable and unaware of the danger that lurked among them. I knew that some of them were close to the end, but the thought of their suffering made me uneasy. I wondered if any of them had sensed my presence, if any of them had looked up and seen the face of their executioner. I stopped at the nurse's station and stared at the logbook, the pages filled with scribbled notes and checklists. The entries looked so mundane, like the work of a normal nurse doing his job, but I knew better. Each tick mark, each note, was a facade hiding the dark truth. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction knowing how easily I had blended into the routine, how unnoticed I had become. A sudden noise broke the stillness, a door slamming shut somewhere down the hall. My heart skipped a beat, and I tensed, straining to hear any sign of movement. Was someone coming? I quickly ducked behind the nurse's station, trying to control my breathing. My thoughts raced, envisioning scenarios where my actions were discovered, where my carefully constructed world fell apart. Just as abruptly as the noise had started, it ended. I waited, barely daring to breathe, my mind on high alert. When I finally dared to peek out, the hallway was empty, as if nothing had happened. I shook my head, trying to push away the paranoia that was creeping in. "You're just being paranoid," I muttered to myself, trying to dispel the mounting fear. But deep down, I knew that the tension wasn't just in my head. It was a constant pressure, a reminder of the fragility of my situation. Every night I walked these halls, I felt the walls closing in, the danger of discovery growing more real. The more I tried to convince myself that everything was under control, the more I feared that it was all slipping through my fingers. And as the hours ticked by, I realized that the real horror might not be the acts I had committed, but the slow, creeping dread of knowing it could all unravel at any moment. The days blurred together, each one melding to the next with a monotonous rhythm of secrecy and dread. I had perfected my routine, covering my tracks with meticulous care. Yet, despite my efforts, a nagging sense of unease followed me everywhere. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to carry a weight of menace that made me question if I was truly safe. One night, I was in the supply room, preparing the medication for the next round of patients. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed unusually loud, echoing in the silence. I glanced at the old wall clock, its tick-tock a constant reminder of the time slipping away. My hands were steady, but my mind was anything but calm. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Just then, I heard a soft rustling noise behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart raced, and I forced myself to focus on my tasks. "It's just your imagination," I whispered, trying to steady my breath. But the unease remained, clawing at the edges of my mind. I quickly finished my preparations and left the room, trying to ignore the cold sweat forming on my brow. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety. I checked on patients with a growing sense of dread, my usual calm replaced by a palpable tension. Each room I entered seemed to hold its own secrets, shadows moving in the periphery of my vision. My thoughts spiraled out of control, imagining every possible scenario where my actions were exposed. At dawn, I finally returned to the nurse's station, feeling a strange mixture of relief and fear. The morning light was too bright, too harsh, casting sharp shadows on the walls. I was just about to leave when I noticed a small, tattered folder on the edge of the desk. It was labeled with a name I didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside were old photographs and news clippings about a series of mysterious deaths at various hospitals over the years. The headlines detailed how the hospitals had been sued and how many patients had died under suspicious circumstances. But what made my blood run cold was a single photo of a man who looked eerily familiar. It was a picture of me, taken from behind, with the caption "Unidentified Nurse, Key Suspect in Serial Killings." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the full extent of the situation. The fear I had felt was not just paranoia. Someone had been watching me all along. I stumbled back from the desk, my mind racing. Had I been so careless that I left behind clues, or was someone else involved, toying with me? The terror of being exposed was overwhelming, but what was even more terrifying was the thought that the real game was only beginning. The photographs suggested a much deeper conspiracy, one that might drag me into a nightmare far beyond my control. When we first moved into the house, I wanted to believe it was the fresh start we desperately needed. The walls were thick, the floors solid, and the air smelled of aged wood and dust. Nothing a good cleaning couldn't fix. The kids were excited, running through the hallways, their laughter echoing through the empty rooms. But there was something off, something I couldn't quite place. That first night, after I tucked the kids into bed, I wandered through the house, trying to familiarize myself with the space. It felt strange, as if the house had a personality of its own, watching me, waiting. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was just the stress of the move. But the creaks and groans that followed me from room to room were unsettling. I could hear them, faint but persistent, almost as if someone was trailing behind me. "Mom, who's that man?" Liam's voice startled me as I was unpacking in the kitchen. I spun around to see him standing by the window, pointing outside. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one there, just the old oak trees swaying in the wind. "What man, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The one standing by the tree," he replied, his tone so matter-of-fact that it sent a shiver down my spine. I shook off the unease, convincing myself that Liam was just adjusting to the new surroundings. Kids have vivid imaginations, right? But later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to ignore the creeping dread. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and settling in, but the strange noises continued. I'd hear footsteps upstairs when I knew the kids were outside, and sometimes the doors would creak open on their own. I told myself it was an old house. Things like this were bound to happen. But deep down, I knew there was something more, something the house wasn't telling me. One night, I found an old photograph tucked behind a loose floorboard in the attic. The The family in the picture looked eerily familiar, almost too familiar. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The woman in the photo could have been my twin, and the two children, a boy and a girl, were spitting images of Liam and Emily. My hands trembled as I shoved the photo back where I found it, trying to ignore the cold knot forming in my stomach. This was supposed to be a new beginning, but the house had other plans. I couldn't get that photograph out of my mind. It was like a splinter lodged deep, festering every time I tried to ignore it. How could a picture of strangers feel so personal? I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where I'd hidden the photo, when Liam walked in. He looked at me with those innocent eyes, completely unaware of the growing darkness in my thoughts. "Mom, why don't you smile anymore?" he asked, his voice soft, almost scared. It broke my heart. I hadn't realized how much I'd been letting this house get to me. I forced a smile, but it felt hollow, like a mask. "I'm just tired, honey. Moving is a lot of work." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. I wasn't convinced either. I'd always been good at hiding my fear, but this house was stripping me of that strength. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I found myself drawn back to the attic. The air was heavy, thick with dust and something else, something oppressive. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my hand trembling as I reached for the light switch. The bulb flickered before it finally sputtered to life, casting long shadows across the wooden beams. I found myself walking to the exact spot where I'd found the photograph, as if some invisible force was pulling me there. As I pried the floorboard loose, a chill ran down my spine. I knew what I was doing was irrational. There was no logical reason to dig deeper into something that was clearly disturbing me. But I couldn't stop myself. Underneath the photograph, there was a small, leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked and worn, and the pages yellowed with age. My hands shook as I opened it. The handwriting was neat but old-fashioned, almost elegant. The entries were dated decades ago, yet as I read the words, they felt eerily current, as if the writer had experienced the same unease that was creeping through me now. I could almost hear the whisper of the pen scratching across the paper, the desperate confessions of someone who had seen too much. The further I read, the more the words blurred, blending with my own growing paranoia. "I can't keep this to myself any longer," one entry read. "The house, it knows. It sees everything. It's not just the memories of the past, it's something darker. I fear for my family." My breath hitched. These weren't just musings of a troubled mind, they were warnings. Warnings that echoed in my own thoughts, growing louder with every creak, every shadow that moved just out of sight. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing, and shoved it back under the floorboard. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I stood there alone in the attic. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I fled downstairs, nearly tripping in my haste. Once I was back in the warmth of the kitchen, I tried to calm myself, but it was no use. The house had secrets, secrets that were starting to unravel me, one strand at a time. I couldn't tell the kids. I couldn't let them see me unravel like this. But deep down, I knew that whatever was in this house had already started to reach out to them too. The nights were getting worse. I could barely sleep, every sound amplified in the darkness. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, as if it were trying to speak to me. I kept telling myself it was just an old house settling, but deep down, I knew it was something more. One night, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from somewhere above me, almost like footsteps. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, my breath caught in my throat. Was someone walking in the attic? It couldn't be, I thought. The kids were asleep, and I hadn't been up there since finding that journal. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to go up there, but I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept out of my room. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon peeking through the windows. I could hear the tapping clearer now, a steady, ominous rhythm that seemed to be calling me. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like I was moving closer to something I shouldn't. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I didn't want to go in there, but I couldn't just turn around. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The tapping stopped. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the dusty floor and the old, forgotten furniture. But there was no one there. The attic was empty, just as it had been the last time. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I walked over to the spot where I'd found the journal, half expecting to see something waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the same worn floorboards and cobweb-covered corners. Maybe I was losing my mind, I thought. Maybe the stress of everything was finally getting to me. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A trapdoor in the far corner of the attic, partially hidden under an old rug. I hadn't noticed it when I first explored the attic. How could I have missed something like that? I walked over, my heart racing, and knelt down to pull the rug aside. The trapdoor was small, barely big enough for a person to fit through, and it had a rusted metal ring attached to it. My hands trembled as I grasped the ring and lifted the door. It creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark space below. The air that wafted up was cold and stale, carrying with it a sense of dread that made my skin crawl. I stared into the darkness, my flashlight barely penetrating the shadows. Something was down there. I could feel it, something that had been hidden away for years. I wanted to close the trapdoor, to walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. I had to know what was down there, even if it terrified me. I lowered myself into the opening, the ladder creaking under my weight. As I descended, the air grew colder, and the sense of dread intensified. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I knew it wasn't going to be anything good. I could feel the walls closing in on me. The house, once full of warmth and potential, now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, something dark and unseen. The noises in the night grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just creaks or groans of an old house settling. They had rhythm, purpose. It was as if someone or something was trying to communicate, to warn or torment me. My heart raced every time I heard them, and I would lie in bed, clutching the covers, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. One night, I decided enough was enough. I needed to confront whatever was happening. The kids were asleep, and I grabbed a flashlight, the only weapon I could think of. My hands shook as I made my way through the dark hallway, the beam of light trembling along with me. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, mocking my bravery. I reached the basement door, which had been locked since we moved in. I had never been down there. Something about it always felt off, wrong. But tonight, I had to know. I unlocked the door and slowly descended the stairs, each creak echoing in the silence. The air grew colder with every step, the scent of damp earth filling my nostrils. The beam from my flashlight caught glimpses of old furniture, cobwebs, and dust-covered boxes. And then, in the far corner, something caught my eye. A large, old trunk, covered in dust and worn by time, stood out. It seemed to call to me, pulling me closer. With trembling hands, I opened the trunk. Inside there were old family photographs, yellowed letters, and a leather-bound journal. As I flipped through the pages, I realized it belonged to the previous owner, a man named James. The journal detailed his life, his family, but the further I read, the more disturbing it became. He wrote of hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there, feeling watched. The entries became more frantic, more desperate. The last page was just scribbles, almost unreadable, but one word stood out: run. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just some old journal. It was a warning, a message from the past. The noises, the feelings of dread, they weren't just in my head. I needed to get out of there, to protect my children. But as I turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. The air grew colder, and I could feel someone watching me. I wasn't alone. I backed away, trying to find another way out, but the shadows seemed to grow, to reach out for me. I could hear whispers now, low and menacing, growing louder with each passing second. My flashlight flickered, then died, leaving me in complete darkness. Panic set in as I stumbled through the basement, trying to find the stairs, the door, anything. But no matter which way I turned, I ended up back at the trunk. And then I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being touched by something unseen. "Leave us," a voice hissed, sending chills down my spine. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, stumbling up the stairs, banging on the door, screaming for help. And just as suddenly as it had closed, the door flew open, and I was free, gasping for air, my heart pounding. But I knew this was far from over. The house wanted us out, and if I didn't figure out how to stop it, we would be next. I barely made it out of the basement alive. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment as I stumbled into the kitchen, slamming the door behind me. The old wood rattled in its frame, but I didn't dare let go of the doorknob. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I wanted to scream, to run, but where would we go? The kids were upstairs, safe for now, but that thing in the basement, it wasn't done with us. I thought about what I'd read in James's journal. The scribbled word, run, played over and over in my mind like a broken record. What had he seen? What had driven him to the edge? I pressed my ear against the door, trying to listen for any movement below. Silence. But it wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that felt like it was watching you, waiting for you to let your guard down. I tried to steady my thoughts. I needed to think clearly. If we stayed here, we wouldn't survive the night. But as I weighed our options, a chilling thought crept into my mind. What if it wasn't the house that was haunted? What if it was us? I shook my head, refusing to believe it. But then I remembered the strange things that started happening before we even moved in, the shadowy figures in the corners of my vision, the feeling of being followed. They weren't tied to this place, they were tied to us. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. But it was just Ethan, standing at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom, what's going on? Why are you crying?" His voice was small, trembling. I hadn't even realized I was crying. I quickly wiped my face, trying to pull myself together. "Nothing, sweetheart. Everything's okay. We need to leave, all right? We need to leave right now." As I hurried him back upstairs, a thought gnawed at the back of my mind, a truth I wasn't ready to face. James had written about hearing voices, feeling watched, but what if he hadn't gone mad? What if he had finally understood what was really happening? My hands shook as I packed our things, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. I grabbed the kids and rushed to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a sudden, intense pressure in my head. It was as if something was trying to push its way into my mind to force me to stay. I staggered back, clutching my skull, the pain blinding. "Mommy, please," Lily's voice broke through the fog, pulling me back to reality. I couldn't let it win. I had to protect them. Summoning every ounce of strength, I threw open the door and ushered the kids outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, jolting me fully awake. I didn't stop until we were in the car, doors locked, engine running. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, but it wasn't what made my blood run cold. Standing in the front yard, where the kids had played just hours before, was a figure. It was barely more than a shadow, but I could feel its eyes on us, its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the night. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. We had escaped, but deep down, I knew this was far from over. That thing had followed us here, and no matter where we went, it would follow us again. I never imagined my life would end up like this, working late shifts at a rundown diner, trying to piece together the fragments of what used to be my world. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the empty tables. I wiped down the counter for the 100th time that night, more to keep my hands busy than anything else. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the walls are closing in, like the silence itself is watching you. I could still feel the bruise on my arm from where he grabbed me last time. My ex-husband, Richard. I thought I was free when the divorce was finalized, but the restraining order was just a piece of paper. It didn't stop him from showing up, from making me feel like a trapped animal every time I saw his name flash across my phone. I kept thinking, maybe tonight would be different. Maybe I'd finally get through a shift without jumping at shadows. But then, the doorbell chimed. I looked up, expecting another regular, someone who'd order coffee and a slice of pie and sit there for hours. Instead, a man walked in, someone I didn't recognize. He looked out of place, too well dressed for this part of town, with a calm demeanor that made me uneasy. He took a seat at the counter, right in front of me, and smiled. "Just coffee, please," he said, his voice smooth and polite, like he had all the time in the world. I poured the coffee, trying to steady my hands. "Anything else?" I asked, hoping he'd say no and leave soon. He shook his head, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. I turned away, pretending to be busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, studying me like I was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. As I busied myself with the dishes, my mind wandered back to the last few months. The fear, the constant looking over my shoulder, wondering when Richard would show up again. I'd gotten so good at pretending everything was fine, but inside, I was always on edge, waiting for the next blow. The man at the counter kept sipping his coffee, quiet, too quiet. Every so often, I'd glance at him, and he'd just smile, like he knew something I didn't. The minutes dragged on, and I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. The fear, the loneliness, the crushing sense of being trapped in a life I didn't recognize anymore. I wanted to run, to grab my son and drive as far away as I could, but where would I go? I had no money, no family, no one to turn to. And that's when it hit me. The man at the counter, with his polite smile and calm eyes, wasn't just passing through. He was here for a reason, and whatever it was, I knew it couldn't be good. The door slammed open so hard the bell snapped off and hit the floor. Richard stormed in, eyes blazing, fists clenched. I froze, the blood draining from my face as he marched straight toward me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were cemented to the linoleum. The diner suddenly felt much smaller, the walls closing in as Richard's rage filled every corner. "You think you can hide from me?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think some stupid piece of paper will keep me away?" His breath reeked of alcohol, and I could see the madness in his eyes. This wasn't the first time he'd shown up like this, but tonight felt different. Worse. There was a wildness in him that I hadn't seen before, like he was teetering on the edge of something dark and irreversible. I glanced at the man sitting at the counter, hoping for help, a witness, anything. He watched calmly, sipping his coffee as if this were the most natural thing in the world. My heart sank. Was he just going to sit there and do nothing? "Richard, please," I begged, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to leave. You're not supposed to be here." "Not supposed to be here?" Richard mocked, slamming his hand on the counter so hard the coffee cup rattled. "This is my family, my life, and you're trying to take it all away from me." His voice cracked with desperation, his anger morphing into something even more dangerous, despair. And that's when I knew I was in real trouble. He wasn't here to scare me. He was here to end this, one way or another. The stranger finally spoke, his voice calm and almost soothing. "Sir, you should leave before things get out of hand." He didn't raise his voice, didn't show a hint of fear. Richard turned to him, caught off guard by the interruption. "Who the hell are you?" Richard sneered, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The stranger just smiled, setting down his cup with deliberate precision. "I'm someone who knows when a situation is about to go too far," the man said, his eyes locking onto Richard's. "And I think you're smarter than to make a decision you can't come back from." There was something in the way he spoke, a quiet authority that seemed to seep into Richard's anger, dulling its edge. For a moment, Richard hesitated, his grip on the counter loosening. I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny crack in the terror that had gripped me since he walked in. Maybe, just maybe, this man could defuse the situation. Maybe Richard would leave, and I could breathe again. But that hope was fragile, hanging by a thread, and I knew how easily it could snap. Richard glared at me one last time, then turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The relief was immediate, but fleeting. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto a stool, shaking. "Thank you," I whispered, still staring at the door, half expecting Richard to burst back in. The man didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. I should have felt safe, grateful even, but something about the whole encounter left me uneasy. The way Richard had backed down so quickly, the way this stranger had taken control without lifting a finger, it all felt wrong, like I'd just traded one danger for another, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The The silence that followed Richard's exit was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and erratic, pounding in my ears. The man was still sitting there, calm as ever, like nothing had happened. I wanted to thank him again, to say something that would make the tension go away, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I found myself staring at the cup in his hands, the way his fingers wrapped around it, too steady, too controlled. "You okay?" His voice broke through my thoughts, gentle yet unnervingly direct. I forced myself to nod, though I knew I wasn't fooling anyone. My hands were still trembling, and I clenched them into fists, hoping he wouldn't notice. He did. "It's normal to be shaken up," he continued, as if reading my mind. "A situation like that, it can rattle you." "Yeah, it's just, he wasn't supposed to be here," I mumbled, the words coming out more as a reflex than anything else. My eyes drifted back to the door, half expecting it to burst open again. I thought I was finally safe. The admission slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted it. I didn't want to seem vulnerable, not to a stranger, not after everything that had happened. But something about him made me drop my guard, even when every instinct screamed at me to keep it up. He nodded, his expression sympathetic, but there was something else there, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "It's hard, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft but intense. "When the people who are supposed to protect you end up being the ones you need protection from." His words hit too close to home, and I felt a lump forming in my throat. I looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, "for stepping in. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." It was the truth, but even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him, something that didn't quite add up. He was too calm, too composed, like he'd been through this before, like he knew exactly how to handle a man like Richard. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his tone almost dismissive. "I did what anyone would do." But there was a chill in his words, a coldness that made my skin prickle. He stood up, sliding a few bills onto the counter, and I realized with a jolt that I didn't even know his name. He smiled, a small, almost pitying smile, and for a moment I felt like a mouse caught in a trap, the door slowly closing in. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't remember telling him my name. Panic flickered in my chest, but before I could say anything, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the eerie stillness of the diner. The door clicked shut behind him, and I felt the air leave my lungs, like I'd been holding my breath the entire time. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all, but the pieces refused to fit together. How had he known my name? Why had Richard, who never backed down from a fight, suddenly left without another word? And why, after everything, did I feel more afraid now than I had when Richard was standing in front of me? The answers eluded me, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the way he looked at me, the way he said my name. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. Something about him had wormed its way under my skin, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it off. The next day at work, I was on edge, jumping at every little sound. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to walk in again, that same calm smile on his face. I felt like I was being watched, even when the diner was empty, even when there was no one around. My nerves were frayed, stretched so thin I thought I might snap. When my shift ended, I hurried home, the darkness pressing in around me like a suffocating blanket. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise felt like a threat. I fumbled with my keys at the door, my heart racing. The moment I stepped inside, I locked everything behind me, door, windows, even the bathroom. I stood there in the middle of my tiny apartment, trying to catch my breath, but it was no use. The fear had its claws in me, and it wasn't letting go. I checked on my son, who was fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside my mind. I wished I could protect him from everything, from everyone, but the truth was, I didn't even know how to protect myself. I sat on the edge of his bed, watching him breathe, the rise and fall of his chest, the only thing keeping me grounded. But that sense of peace was fleeting. slipping away the moment I heard a faint knock at the door. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself, but the knock came again, louder this time. I stood up, my legs trembling, and crept toward the door, every step a battle against the rising tide of panic. I peeked through the peephole, praying it was just a neighbor, someone who had the wrong apartment. But it wasn't. It was him, the man from the diner. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, that same unsettling smile on his face. I backed away, my mind racing. How did he find me? What did he want? My thoughts were a blur, spinning out of control. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I needed to call the police. I needed help. But before I could dial, I heard his voice, muffled through the door. "Evelyn, I know you're there. I just want to talk." His tone was calm, almost friendly, but it was laced with something else, something dark. "You don't have to be afraid." But I was. I was terrified. I backed away from the door, the phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. All I could hear was his voice, smooth and persuasive, wrapping around me like a noose. "Go away," I whispered, more to myself than to him, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. He didn't respond, but I could feel his presence on the other side of the door, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I needed to get out, needed to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, and he knew it. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until I thought I might scream. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than his voice. I stayed frozen in place long after he left, listening to the silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had he come here? What did he want? The questions circled endlessly, but I had no answers, only the cold knot of dread tightening in my chest. I should have called the police, but my phone was still on the floor, the screen cracked from the fall. I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. Sleep was out of the question. I sat on the couch, every light in the apartment blazing, my nerves stretched so tight they felt like they might snap. My son slept peacefully in the other room, unaware of the danger that had just been at our door. I wanted to wake him, to hold him close, but I didn't want to scare him. He didn't deserve that. He deserved to feel safe, even if I couldn't. The hours crawled by, each minute heavier than the last. I kept expecting him to come back, kept waiting for another knock, but it never came. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of shadows moving just out of sight, of a voice whispering my name over and over. I woke to the sound of my son's laughter, sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a nightmare, a figment of my exhausted mind. But the cracked phone on the floor and the lingering sense of unease told me otherwise. I tried to push the thoughts away, tried to focus on getting us ready for the day, but it was like a splinter lodged in my brain. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't dislodge it. At work, I was a mess. Every time the door opened, my heart leapt into my throat, my eyes darting to the face of every customer who walked in. But he didn't come back. The day dragged on, each hour more unbearable than the last, until finally, my shift ended. I was about to leave when the waitress on the next shift walked in, her face pale, eyes wide. "Evelyn," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." She handed me her phone, and as I took it, a cold wave of dread washed over me. I didn't want to look, but I had to. The screen showed a news article, the headline screaming at me, "Serial killer caught in local standoff, suspect linked to multiple murders." My stomach dropped as I scanned the article, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The description matched him perfectly. The man from the diner, the man who had come to my door. The article went on to detail his crimes, the women he had lured, the lives he had taken. My mind reeled, struggling to process it all. He had been so close, right there, and I had let him walk away. But it was the last detail that made my blood run cold. The standoff had ended hours ago. They had found him in his apartment, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. On the wall above his bed, scrawled in what looked like blood, were the words, "I'll be seeing you soon, Evelyn." My vision blurred, the words swimming in front of me as the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. How had he known? How had he planned this so perfectly? A chill settled deep in my bones, and I knew that no matter where I went, no matter what I did, I would never escape the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. And somehow, someway, he would keep his promise. That first night at the beach house was supposed to be peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just the silence after being surrounded by the constant noise of the city for so long. I told myself that was all it was, just the quiet playing tricks on my mind. Yet, as I lay in bed, listening to the waves crash against the shore, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like something shifting outside. I sat up, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. It was probably nothing, I reasoned. Maybe a stray animal, or just the wind moving something outside. I wanted to believe that, but there was this unsettling weight in my chest that I couldn't ignore. "You're just tired," I whispered to myself, trying to sound convincing. Still, I felt a strange urge to check, to make sure everything was as it should be. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside, the cold sand biting at my bare feet. The air was heavy with the smell of salt, a scent I usually found comforting, but tonight it felt different, almost suffocating. I scanned the area, the light cutting through the darkness in jagged arcs. Everything seemed normal. The beach was deserted, and the house stood as still as ever. But that feeling, the one that something wasn't right, only grew stronger. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was late, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. I headed back inside, locking the door behind me, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts raced, replaying the moment over and over. What if it wasn't just my imagination? What if someone was out there, watching? It wasn't like I hadn't had close calls before. Running a busy kitchen in the city, I'd faced my share of dangerous situations, angry customers, late-night walk-ins, even a few break-ins. But this was different. Out here, there was no one to call for help. The nearest town was miles away, and I was completely alone. As I finally drifted off to sleep, that uneasy feeling lingered, a shadow in the back of my mind. I tried to push it aside, to focus on the reason I came here in the first place, to relax, to recharge. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Something had been set in motion, something I couldn't quite understand yet, but it was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, I woke up with the uneasy sensation that something was terribly wrong. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, but it did little to chase away the lingering dread from the night before. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, just a mix of exhaustion and the unfamiliar surroundings. But as I stood at the kitchen counter, sipping my coffee, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the sand outside, leading away from the house. I nearly dropped my mug. The prints were fresh, unmistakable, and they weren't mine. They traced a path from the side of the house down to the water's edge. My pulse quickened as I stared at them, my mind racing with questions. Who had been out there? Why were they so close to the house? More importantly, why hadn't I heard anything? Panic started to bubble up inside me. I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. Maybe it was just someone passing by, I muttered under my breath, though I knew that was unlikely. This stretch of the beach was private, the house isolated from any neighbors. Whoever it was, they had no reason to be here. I spent the next hour combing through every corner of the house, checking the locks on the doors and windows, searching for any sign of forced entry. Everything seemed intact, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside set me on edge. I tried to call a friend, someone who could offer a rational explanation, but my phone was dead. "Great," I muttered, feeling a fresh wave of anxiety. I plugged it into the charger and paced the living room, replaying the events in my head. It was like I was trapped in some sort of nightmare, one that wouldn't end no matter how much I wanted it to. By the time my phone had enough charge to turn on, I was in full-blown panic mode. My hands shook as I dialed the number, but the call wouldn't go through. No service. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. I was completely cut off, alone with my growing fears. "Calm down, Marcelo," I told myself, though the words felt hollow. You're just overreacting." But deep down, I knew this wasn't an overreaction. Someone had been here, close enough to the house to leave those prints. And now, with no way to call for help, I was completely vulnerable. As the day dragged on, my nerves frayed. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints, the stark reminder that I wasn't alone. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching. The isolation of the beach, once peaceful, now felt like a trap. By late afternoon, I was struggling to hold on to any sense of calm. I decided to keep myself busy, trying to force my mind away from the creeping dread. I cleaned the kitchen, swept the floors, even rearranged the furniture in the living room. But every small sound, a branch scraping against the window, the distant call of a seabird, set me on edge. My movements grew more frantic, my heart pounding in my chest as the silence closed in around me. When I finally sat down to eat, I realized I hadn't been hungry all day. My stomach churned as I forced down a few bites of the sandwich I'd made, but the food tasted like ash in my mouth. I pushed the plate away, my appetite gone. "What am I doing here?" I whispered to the empty room. The words hung in the air, a bitter reminder of my solitude. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the house. I turned on every light, trying to chase away the darkness, but it only made the shadows sharper, more menacing. I caught my reflection in the window, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. My eyes were wide, haunted, like a cornered animal. "Get a grip, Marcelo," I muttered, clenching my fists until my knuckles turned white. But no matter how much I tried to reassure myself, the fear gnawed at me. Something wasn't right. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The rational part of my mind told me I was safe, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But my instincts screamed otherwise. I decided to check the house again, this time armed with a kitchen knife. It felt ridiculous, holding the blade as if I knew what to do with it, but the cold metal in my hand gave me a sliver of confidence. I moved through each room with slow, deliberate steps, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes searching for any movement. The house was eerily quiet, the silence almost deafening. When I reached the bedroom, I hesitated before pushing open the door. A part of me didn't want to see what might be waiting on the other side, but I forced myself to look. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the knife. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, an envelope lying on the bed where it hadn't been before. My blood ran cold as I picked it up, my hands trembling. The envelope was unmarked, sealed shut. I stared at it, my heart racing. "Who?" I breathed, the question hanging in the air as I tore it open, dreading what I might find inside. I pulled the letter out of the envelope, my hands shaking. The paper felt rough against my fingertips, as if it had been handled many times before. I unfolded it slowly, afraid of what I might read. The message was scrawled in a jagged, uneven handwriting, each letter sharp and precise. "Marcelo," it began, "I see you've noticed. How observant. But you're not the first, and you won't be the last. You think you're safe here, but this house holds more than just memories." I read it over again, my eyes struggling to keep up with the hastily written words. I felt a chill run down my spine. The message was more than a threat. It was a taunt. It was as if the writer knew exactly how to strike at my deepest fears. "This is insane," I murmured to myself. "Someone is playing a sick game." I glanced around the room, as if expecting someone to jump out from behind the furniture. The shadows seemed to lengthen and shift, mocking me. I could feel my pulse racing, the thud in my ears nearly deafening. What did this person want from me? The letter didn't make that clear. It only seemed to suggest that whatever was happening was part of a much larger, darker plan. The thought of being watched made me feel exposed. I began pacing the room, trying to keep my mind clear and focused. "Think, Marcelo, think," I told myself. "What can you do to protect yourself?" The house felt like it was closing in on me. I could almost hear the walls whispering, the floorboards creaking under invisible footsteps. I decided to look around for any other clues, anything that might give me a hint about who was behind this. The letter offered no answers, only more questions. I inspected every room again, this time more thoroughly. I checked the closets, looked under the beds, and even rifled through the drawers, but found nothing out of the ordinary. As I returned to the living room, I noticed the envelope lying on the floor, just a few feet from where I had left it. My breath caught in my throat. How had it ended up there? I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The realization that someone had been in the room while I was searching hit me like a punch to the gut. My entire body tensed, and I could barely think straight. Who was in my house? How did they get in? I had to get out of there, but I knew I had to be smart about it. If I made a wrong move, it could be the last one I ever made. The noise from the storm outside drowned out all other sounds. I could barely think over the howling wind and relentless rain. My mind raced through the events of the last few hours, desperately trying to make sense of it all. My hands shook as I held the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness of the living room. I checked every door and window for the 100th time, but they were all locked tight. The letter, the shadows, and the creeping sense of dread had me on edge. I needed to do something, anything, to feel like I was in control again. My nerves were frayed, and my patience was wearing thin. What had started as a weekend getaway had turned into a nightmare I couldn't escape. I decided to inspect the attic. It was an old, dusty space that I had barely touched since moving in. The narrow staircase creaked under my weight as I climbed. Each step felt like a mile, each creak like a shout in the silence. I pushed open the attic door, and the musty air hit me. I turned on the flashlight and scanned the room. Old furniture covered in sheets, forgotten boxes stacked in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I saw it. Among the boxes was an old, wooden trunk with a rusty lock. My heart pounded as I approached it. Could this be another part of the twisted game? I had to know. I pried open the trunk with trembling hands, the lock snapping off with a loud crack. Inside were stacks of old newspapers and personal items, photographs, letters, and what looked like an old journal. I flipped through the journal, my eyes scanning the scrawled entries. The words described someone who was obsessed with control, someone who delighted in terrorizing others. I froze when I saw a page detailing a plan to break someone in a house isolated by nature. The chilling realization hit me like a wave. The person who wrote this journal was the same person tormenting me, and they had been watching me all along, just as they had watched the victims before. A noise from downstairs made me jump. I could barely breathe as I strained to listen. The sound of footsteps was unmistakable. Someone was in the house. I darted back down the stairs, every nerve in my body screaming to flee. I reached the front door, but it was locked from the outside. My heart sank as I realized that I was trapped. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, the only thing I had that might offer some protection. My mind raced as I tried to come up with a plan. I knew that my best chance was to stay hidden and wait for the storm to pass. But as I crouched in the dark, I could feel the eyes on me, the sense that I was no longer alone. The oppressive fear was suffocating. The thought that the killer might already be in the house, watching and waiting, kept me paralyzed. In that moment of terror, I understood something horrifying. The killer's game was not just about survival. It was about making me feel as if I was already defeated, as if my fear was their ultimate victory. As I waited in the dark, the cold realization settled in. The real horror was not just the physical threat, but the psychological torture that had already begun. The old house was just as I remembered, quiet, secluded, with a sort of eerie stillness that creeps into your bones when you've been away from it for too long. I came here to escape, to breathe again, away from the suffocating noise of the city. But the silence was almost too perfect, too complete, like it had been waiting for me. I set my bags down in the foyer, the thud of them echoing in the empty space. "Home sweet home," I muttered, though the words felt hollow. This place had always been my sanctuary, a refuge where I could lose myself in my thoughts. But as I stood there, the weight of the quiet pressed down on me. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, and now that I was back, it was ready to exhale. I walked through the rooms, flicking on lights, trying to dispel the gloom that seemed to cling to every corner. The familiar creaks of the floorboards beneath my feet were a strange comfort, grounding me in the reality that this was my place. I was safe here, away from the chaos, just me and my thoughts. I needed to focus, to let the ideas flow and find their way onto the page. By the time I settled into the study, night had fully fallen. The darkness outside was impenetrable, the windows reflecting nothing but the dim glow of my desk lamp. I powered up my laptop, its hum breaking the stillness, and stared at the blank screen. The cursor blinked, mocking me, daring me to fill the void. I typed a few words, then erased them, the frustration gnawing at the edges of my calm. "Come on, Anthony, get it together," I muttered to myself, rubbing my temples. Then, out of nowhere, the first message appeared. The screen flickered, and there it was, a single line, typed out as if by an unseen hand. "You shouldn't have come back." My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. Who would send this? How? My internet connection was off, the nearest neighbor miles away. It had to be a glitch, some leftover junk from an old document or a prank gone wrong. "Very funny," I said aloud, half expecting a response, but the room was silent. I deleted the message and tried to refocus, but my concentration was shattered. Every creak of the house seemed louder, more menacing, like it was warning me of something I couldn't see. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping into my thoughts. This was exactly why I'd come here, to get away from distractions, from the noise, from everything. But the house had other plans. I tried to shake off the strange message, but it clung to me like a shadow. I busied myself unpacking, moving through the house with a purpose I didn't quite feel. The ticking of the clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, each second dragging out like it was trying to stretch the night. I told myself it was just the old house settling, the way it always did, but that didn't stop my imagination from running wild. By the time I'd finished, the tension in my chest had loosened a bit. I made some coffee, the smell of it filling the air, a small comfort in the growing unease. I needed to focus, to remind myself why I was here. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to dive into my work without any distractions, but my thoughts kept circling back to that message. You shouldn't have come back. Who would even know I was here? I sat back down at my desk, determined to push through. I pulled up the document I'd been working on, hoping the familiar words would anchor me. But as soon as I started typing, the message appeared again, this time longer. "You think you can just hide here, Anthony? It's too late for that." My fingers froze on the keyboard. I could feel the blood draining from my face. This wasn't some random glitch. Someone was trying to mess with me, and they were doing a damn good job of it. "Who the hell is this?" I whispered, my voice barely breaking the silence. The house offered no answer, just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to creak open on its own. This was ridiculous, I told myself. I was a grown man, a writer for God's sake. I lived in my head, made a living out of spinning tales of terror and suspense. I knew better than to let something like this get to me. But knowing that and feeling it were two very different things. I closed the laptop, trying to shut out the anxiety gnawing at the edges of my mind. The walls felt closer than they had before, the room smaller, more confining. I got up, pacing back and forth, every nerve in my body on edge. The creaks and groans of the house that had once been familiar now felt like the stirrings of something sinister, lurking just out of sight. I needed air, space, something to clear my head. Grabbing my coat, I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The silence out there was different, heavier somehow. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me, the trees standing like silent sentinels. My breath came out in quick puffs, visible in the dim light of the moon. As I stood there, trying to calm myself, a rustling noise came from the tree line. I froze, my eyes straining to see through the shadows. But there was nothing, just the wind in the leaves, or so I tried to convince myself. I turned back to the house, but the sense of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. This was supposed to be my safe space, my escape from the madness of the world, but now I wasn't so sure I'd left that madness behind. Back inside, the silence was thicker, almost suffocating. The shadows seemed darker, like they had deepened in the short time I was outside. I felt an urge to turn on every light, to push back the darkness, but it felt like giving in. I shook my head, trying to clear the irrational thoughts. It was just a house, the same one I'd spent countless summers in, writing, thinking, escaping. But something had changed, hadn't it? Or maybe it was me. I couldn't stop thinking about the message. You shouldn't have come back. The words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that I was no longer alone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, someone from town who knew I'd be here. But that didn't make sense. Nobody knew I was coming, not even my editor. I'd kept it quiet on purpose, wanting to retreat into my own world for a while. So how did they know? And why did it feel like a threat? I opened my laptop again, half expecting another message to pop up. When nothing happened, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I needed to focus, to stop letting my imagination run wild. It was too easy for a writer to fall into that trap, to blur the lines between reality and fiction. But this felt different, more real. I stared at the blank document, my fingers hovering over the keys. Just write, I told myself, but the words wouldn't come. The house creaked again, the sound so sharp it made me jump. Get a grip, Anthony, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I was letting this place get to me. The isolation, the silence, it was all playing tricks on my mind. I needed to distract myself, to ground myself in something tangible. I picked up my phone, scrolling aimlessly through emails and messages. But even that didn't help. The sense of unease only grew stronger, as if something was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started to wonder if maybe I should leave. It was crazy, I knew that. But the idea of staying another night, alone with these thoughts, made my skin crawl. I glanced at the door, imagining myself grabbing my keys, driving back to the city, to the noise and the people. But that felt like defeat. I wasn't going to let some ghost in the machine chase me away. I had to stay, to figure this out, to face whatever was happening head on. Just as I was about to shut down my laptop, another message flashed on the screen. You can't hide from yourself. The words were like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of me. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. What the hell is going on? I whispered, the words barely audible in the stillness. I could feel my hands trembling, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. Whoever was doing this knew me, knew my fears, my doubts, and they were using it against me. I decided to leave the laptop and check the house. The tension was unbearable, every creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet amplifying my anxiety. I went from room to room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I half expected to find someone hiding in a corner or crouched behind a door, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the house, echoing back at me. I paused in the living room, staring at the old fireplace. My grandmother used to tell me ghost stories about this house. As a child, I'd always dismissed them as tall tales. Now, standing alone in the dark, those stories seemed all too real. I tried to shake it off. There's no ghost here, I told myself. It's just someone messing with me. Then, I noticed something out of place. A photo frame that had been on the mantel was now lying face down on the floor. I picked it up, the glass slightly cracked. The picture inside was of Abigail and me, taken years ago. How did this get here? I wondered aloud. I'd specifically placed it on the desk in my study. The realization hit me. Someone had been in my space. My heart pounded harder as I realized this was more than just a prank. Someone knew my habits, my personal items. The lights flickered, and I jumped. I went to check the fuse box, hoping for a simple explanation. But when I opened it, everything seemed fine. The power was stable. I was alone in this house, yet it felt like I was being watched. The paranoia was creeping in again. I needed to calm down, to get a grip on myself. Stay focused, I said, more to myself than anything else. There has to be a logical explanation. I headed back to the study, the place where I felt the most secure, even though that was rapidly changing. As I entered, the computer screen was on, showing a new message. You're running out of time. The message was chilling, more so because I had been away from the computer. I hadn't even heard it come on. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I needed to figure out who was behind this and why they were using my own stories against me. Sitting in front of the screen, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The walls seemed to close in on me. The room was too quiet, too still. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to open on its own. The shadows cast by the dim light made everything look sinister. I knew I had to confront this head-on. Whoever you are, I said aloud, trying to summon courage, show yourself. Stop hiding. The silence that followed was suffocating. I was caught in a web of my own fears, and the only way out was to face whatever nightmare was unfolding before me. I was exhausted, sitting in the dark, the only light coming from the flickering monitor. Each new message was like a knife twisting in my gut. "You're running out of time." What did that even mean? I could feel my grip on reality slipping. My stories, my fiction, were blending with my reality, and I couldn't separate one from the other. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from behind me. I spun around, but the room was still. I crept toward the source of the noise, my flashlight sweeping over the walls, revealing nothing but shadows and dust. The sound stopped abruptly, and the silence was more unsettling than the noise. I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I decided to confront my fears directly. I took the flashlight and moved carefully through the house, checking each room once more. In the study, I noticed something different. The desk drawer was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I hesitated, then pulled it open fully. Inside was a stack of old, yellowed paper, manuscripts from years ago, drafts of stories I had long forgotten. As I flipped through them, one manuscript caught my eye. It was a story I had written about a writer being tormented by his own creations. I shuddered as I read the passage describing a writer receiving ominous messages and seeing figures from his stories come to life. It was almost as if I had written my own fate into existence. Suddenly, I heard a noise from upstairs, a loud thud followed by the sound of footsteps. My heart raced. I grabbed the fireplace poker for protection and cautiously made my way up the stairs. The floorboards creaked with every step, amplifying my anxiety. I reached the top and saw the door to my bedroom ajar. The room was dark, and I could barely make out a figure standing by the window. I approached slowly, each step echoing in the silent house. I called out, "Show yourself!" My voice trembled, but I was determined to face whatever or whoever was tormenting me. The figure turned around, and the light from the window revealed a face I recognized all too well. It was me, a twisted, distorted version of myself, with eyes that seemed hollow and a grin that was far too wide. It was like looking into a mirror, but the reflection was alive, and it was mocking me. I stumbled back, realizing the truth. My own mind had created this horror, feeding off my fears and my stories. The messages, the disturbances, they were all products of my imagination gone awry. The line between fiction and reality had vanished, leaving me trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I was my own monster, and I had no idea how to escape from the hell I had written myself into.